Many of you tried alcohol markers because, well, you weren't sure about your art skills, and markers looked so easy. Now you're kind of wondering what you've gotten yourself into, because brush nibs make you feel clumsy. You're constantly going outside the lines, and they're too big to color little details. But then you see people making stuff like this, and I'm using the same markers you're using. So what is it you're missing? Today, let's look at big fat markers with big fat brush nibs and some of the tricks that I use to create teeny tiny details. Look, I'm right there with you. If I had 3 wishes before I asked for world peace and then calorie-free lasagna, I would use my first wish for a set of miniature Copics. I've been using illustration markers for 30 years now, and still, with every project, I would love to have a smaller brush nib. Every project? Jeez! There are just these little spaces and teeny tiny details, and they're so hard to color with this big honkin' brush nib. And that's one of the major downsides to marker art. Our projects are one size fits all. Think about it. If you're a painter, you can always switch to a smaller paintbrush. But in markers, we're stuck with this. We can't go bigger, and we can't get smaller. We try to color everything from 20-inch backgrounds to the freckles on a flea, all with the same brush nib. But wait, it gets worse. Because ink is a wet medium. So just when I'm patting myself on the back because I got into that tiny corner and still somehow managed to stay inside the lines, the ink goes bleh, and as it dries, it gets all rounded and it oozes out beyond my outline. I mean, really, I've been doing markers for decades now, and I still struggle with corners, points, and straight edges. So today, I've got some tips for you to deal with this one-size-fits-all problem, and a few helpful products that can do tiny jobs better than a big old brush nib. Now, some of you know me by now. I'm not a normal YouTuber, because in YouTube land, everybody's an art cheerleader.
You can do anything. All it takes is an open heart and a little practice.
It sounds good in theory, but here in the real world, I've had to come to grips with the fact that I am never going to win a gold medal for women's gymnastics. So here's today's tough love. Markers may not be the right medium for you. I'm not saying you can't do art. It's just maybe you're not a good fit for markers. Just to be blunt here, markers require a very steady hand. If you're someone with neurologic issues or neuropathy in your hands, markers are going to be difficult for you. An artist who is like standing at an easel using a long-handled paintbrush, her hand can wobble quite a bit, and that wobble won't necessarily show up on the canvas. But your hand is a lot closer to the paper when you're coloring with a marker. Any art form where your hand is tight in on the surface, and if you're coloring very small images, well, then every shake is going to show. So we just have to accept the fact that markers are not very forgiving. And this isn't age-related. I'm 53 right now, and I have a steadier hand now than I had in my 20s. But I know I can't use markers forever. It wouldn't shock me if, like 10 years from now, I'm back standing at an easel. If I'm using markers, I'll probably be doing less realism and more expressive strokes. Because the control that I've learned over the years, it's not going to last forever. I'm sorry, this is just, well, this is how life works. Even if you don't have dexterity issues, there's something that not enough videos talk about. I meet so many students who have been doing this marker thing for a long time, and yet they've never heard this mentioned. Speed and pressure. They're incredibly important with markers. Your brush nib is like a wet kitchen sponge. Now think about me setting my drippy kitchen sponge on your new silk dress. That's going to leave a mark. Especially if I hang out here for a long time and maybe even press down really hard. Your marker releases ink whenever it comes in contact with paper. So the slower you move, the more time it has to release ink. And if you're someone with a death grip on their marker, if you're holding that marker with the strength of 10,000 men, you're deliberately squishing extra ink into the paper. Artists love brush nibs because they're what we call a responsive point. Responsive points flex under pressure and they spring back when they're released. So to control a brush nib, you have to move fast and you have to press just hard enough to make a mark, but not so hard that you flood the paper. This takes time to learn, and you lose your control skills if you don't color regularly. And I think that's why so many card makers convert over to bullet nib markers. They don't really color enough to learn how to control the brush nib, so the bullet feels safer and more reliable. And that's fine with me. If you're just a once-in-a-while colorer, bullet nibs might be a better fit for you. But bullet nibs are not good for blending because they're not juicy. You're switching to the bullet because you didn't want juicy, right? So then you can't get mad when you don't have enough moisture to blend properly. Speed control, pressure control, that's what's going to help you get the best from your brush nibs. And by the way, while we're on the subject of nibs, brush nibs do not last forever. Sometimes nibs get damaged, and most people have no trouble changing a nib that's like bent over sideways, or it's got glitter glue stuck to the side of it. But I meet people who have been coloring for years, and they have never changed a nib. Paper, it feels smooth to your fingers, but if you look at it under a microscope, paper is rough. It's jagged, like a nail file. Your marker nib is made from soft cotton, and every time you rub it across the paper, that paper is slowly sanding away at your brush nib. You'll never see it happening. Every once in a while, you might notice some hairs kind of hanging off the tip of the nib. But the big problem is when your brush nib gets worn down and you lose the point entirely. When your nib is rounded instead of pointy, your coloring will be less accurate. You'll go outside the lines more. You're rounding off those tight corners, and you'll have little rounded blobs where you really don't want them. You can only do precision work with a precision point. I change my marker nibs just to keep the points sharp. Most of them get changed at least once a year, and on my most used colors, I probably go through 2 to 3 nibs per year. But remember, I do a ton of coloring. I'm teaching classes and doing YouTube. I'm coloring big projects every day. I probably color far more often than the average colorist. I don't know how often you color, so I can't say how long your nibs are going to last, but it's a good habit to glance at the point every time you uncap a marker. If it's got hairs hanging off the end, or if it's not pointy anymore, You need a new nib. Okay, I have it on my list here to talk about the size of your projects, but I think you already know this. Big brush nib, tiny little spaces, that's just a no-go for smart marker artists. The more room you have to color, the easier it is to stay inside the lines. And if you only color teeny tiny stamps for teeny tiny cards, look, I'm not going to tell you to use big old markers. Most of you have already figured this out. The wise little Rembrandt on your shoulder has been telling you to find a smaller marker for years. But I will say one thing about line art. I really do think it's easier to have light outlines which disappear underneath the color. Think about it. If these candy canes were printed with bold black outlines, you would be able to see every single spot where I went outside the lines. It's easier to make corrections and to camouflage those mistakes without the black lines tattletaling on me. This dot here is not as round as it should be. This stripe went a little wider than the line art, but that's okay. I just made the dot bigger. I made the candy cane just a little bit thicker over here. And you wouldn't know this if I hadn't confessed. If you really like the black line work, add it back after you're done coloring, and then make it look like you always intended to have one wonky piece of candy. Oh, and see what I did with the water brush? My gray outline here is pretty light, but it's still too dark to disappear underneath the white stripes. I'm wetting the printer ink with just a little bit of water, and then I'm dabbing up the color to make the stamp even lighter where there's going to be a white stripe. Now, you can't do this with laser printing. I'm using a Copic safe inkjet, but this is one of those little secret steps that I rarely show on camera. I do this a lot when I have a white object that's sitting on a white background. No lines makes it easier to camouflage the inevitable mistakes. From here on out, let's talk about the coloring process. And the first thing to notice is that I always color dark to light. Now, normally, I really don't care what you do. Some people love to color light to dark. Some of us color dark to light. Whatever floats your boat, we're all friends here. But if we're talking about tiny details, I've got to encourage you to start with the dark. People who color light to dark, they begin with their lightest marker, right? You add more layers going darker, and then you work back through the light markers, blending along the way. Me, I cut that in half. Look at the difference between the number of ink layers between the two methods. Now here's the catch. Instead of thinking of these as ink layers, think of this as how many times you have to be perfect. You've got to color flawlessly for every layer, making perfectly perfect edges, perfect corners, every single layer. Me, I only have to be perfect 3 times. You're trying to be perfect 5 times or even more. Every layer is another opportunity to mess it up. To me, it's better just to get in and get out. On the small, tight stuff, I do as few layers as possible. Okay, next Copic tip. Color your way into a corner. Don't start in the corner and work your way out. Why? Well, when we look at the stroke of a marker, and this is true for pencils or paintbrushes too. Okay, so one single stroke. When we make that stroke, we press harder at the beginning of the stroke than we do at the end. We all do it. This is just how the muscles in your hand work. Plant the marker, then stroke and lift off. Plant, stroke, and lift. Plant, stroke, and lift. See what happens? The starting point, because we press harder there, Remember, pressing releases extra ink, so the beginning of a stroke is always fatter and juicier than the end of a stroke. And if you do it right, most of your strokes will have these natural little points on the end. Wouldn't it be smart to put those little points in the corners? A lot of people overthink it and they try to micromanage the shape.
I want the shape to end right here, so I'm going to plant my marker in the tiniest part of the corner.
And this is why your corners look rounded, because you're putting the roundest part of the stroke in the pointiest part of the corner. Now, if you watch me closely, I don't do this as often as I should. And every time I do it, I immediately regret starting in the point. But the smart plan on these stripes is that every taper, it should start somewhere in here and it should end with a point exactly where I need the point the most. Keep reminding yourself, and I have to remind myself about this all the time. Don't start in the corner. And real quick, before we move away from Copic, don't assume that my coloring is perfect. We always think everyone else's coloring looks better than our own. But here's my project at the end of the Copic phase. Mistake, wobble, rounded point, wobble, mistake, mistake, mistake. It's not perfect, but here's how I fixed it. So what's that saying? The way to be smart is to stop making dumb mistakes? I love Copics, but let's be realistic. A Copic cannot do everything. I do not draw delicate cat whiskers with Copic markers. That's a dumb mistake. I also don't try to draw thin little stripes on a candy cane. I'm using a fine line pen, which matches my Copic red. This is a Staedtler Tri-Plus fine liner. It's 0.3 millimeters, which is a heck of a lot smaller than my Copic nib. Yes, I'm sure there's some perfect marker goddess out there, and she could get up onto the point of her marker nib and draw tiny little lines. But that ain't me. I know my limits. And here's the thing I don't think you think about. There are no big prizes for coloring everything with nothing but Copic. You don't get bonus points or air miles for doing it all with one brand of marker. I do not enjoy fighting with my markers, so as soon as I start to struggle with something, the little Rembrandt on my shoulder tells me to switch to a smaller tool. Tri-Plus are safe to use with Copic markers, and they come in 60 colors. I'm always amazed at how well one red pen can match several different red Copics. For these small stripes, this is basically my mini Copic. These pens are water-based, so I wouldn't use one to color the small candies here. These things can damage the paper if you go over something too many times. But for adding whiskers or pinstripes, or how about the pupil of a small eye, these things are invaluable. And by the way, here's why I didn't include the thin stripes on the digital stamp. Because I know I'm going to mess up several of these stripes. 5 perfectly straight, evenly spaced lines, it's just not going to happen. I'm making them a bit messy and I'm crossing the stripes over on purpose because I know eventually I'm going to screw it up. This way, the irregular stripes are a feature, not a big honkin' mistake. See, I know my limits. I try not to set myself up to fail. Now let's fix my big stripes. I've learned the hard way to stop fixing edges and points with a Copic. We have all been there. You make a dot, but the dot's not round enough, so you make it rounder. But then the dot next to it isn't the same size, so you fix that one. Then you try and get this one to match, but now this one's too small, and oops. Set the Copic down. Fixing the fix of a fix? It just makes it worse. Now, normally when you see me coloring, I use very soft, waxy colored pencils. Sometimes I'm lazy though, and if I'm coloring along and I come to like a wobbly marker edge or a rounded corner, I got a pencil in my hand, right? So I will try and fix corners or straighten the edges with one of my soft pencils. But I shouldn't do this. Soft pencils are very easy to smudge. They just don't make clean, crisp lines very well. So when I'm behaving myself, I have a set of Pablo colored pencils. Pablos are a hard colored pencil, and this makes them perfect for fixing small details. They sharpen to a very fine point, which means I can get in there and crisp up some of those wobbly lines and I can extend some of these points, wrapping the stripe perfectly around the body of the candy cane. Sometimes you just need a firmer pencil with a teeny tiny point. Speaking of colored pencils, I also use pencils to reduce the number of markers in my blending combination. I was able to use only 2 red markers for each stripe. And remember, 2 layers means I only have to be perfect twice. I really try hard not to give myself chances to mess it up. Okay, so I'm using a magic pencil here to add shading. This is a Derwent Lightfast pencil called Purple. There's no number on these guys, it's just purple. Now, I'm not using it for the color. See, I'm using it because it's dark and transparent. With this pencil, I can add darkness and turn the form on each one of these stripes. And here's the key. Because this pencil is so transparent, it's adding shade without looking purple. So I can use this pencil over a red Copic, it can go over a green Copic. It's transparent, so it shades, but the original color still shines through. And it's a pencil, so it's small. I can control the shade better than if I shaded with a big old marker. There are several pencils like this. They're chameleons. The ones that I use the most are Derwent Lightfast Purple, Derwent Lightfast Violet, Prismacolor Indigo Blue, and Prismacolor Prussian Green. And because they're magic colors, I honestly could have used any of these pencils over the red stripes to shade them. They would all work. If you want to know more about this method, I use it in all my online classes. While we're talking about special pencils, I also highlight with colored pencils rather than marker. A lot of tutorials have you work that highlight color into the marker blending combination. But these stripes are so narrow that I can barely blend the 2 colors. There is no way I can work another couple of markers in there to get the right highlight color. Instead, I highlight with a white pencil. Prismacolor White is one of the most opaque white pencils on the market. I'm using it as the soft and gentle highlights along the edge of the candy canes. For a stronger white reflection, I'm going to use the most opaque of all the white pencils. This is the Stabilo All Pencil. It's very soft, which means it applies thick and opaque. I will use it for the skittery light that's kind of dancing through the middle of each stripe. Notice there's a slight texture to the surface of these candy canes, and it's these little ridges which are catching the light. By highlighting with these tiny hatching pencil strokes, I can easily recreate this detail. I could never do this kind of subtle texture with a Copic, or a white pen for that matter. One more tool for you. It's funny. My son edits my videos, and of my 3 now adult children, he's the only one who doesn't draw or do any artsy craftsy stuff. Anyway, he edits the footage and he picks the parts of the coloring to show you. So I'm always startled when he includes footage of me erasing things. Because, well, you're here for the coloring. Who wants to watch me fix mistakes? But he's got a really good point. If I have a pencil in my hand, there is always an eraser close by, and I use it a lot. Not just to erase either. This is a mono zero eraser, and it's tiny. I don't always get the pencil exactly where it should go, so many of my corners and those small details have been improved and straightened with this eraser. I also use it to smudge and fade away pencil edges that I made too crisp. This eraser is always by my side. I use it on every project, and you would never know about it if my editor hadn't found it interesting. Alcohol markers can make beautiful blends, and they're a vital part of my art process. Today, we talked about why I can't rely on Copics to do everything, and why I'm a mixed media artist rather than a marker artist. But it's not just an issue of coloring tiny details with a giant marker. There's a larger problem with marker blending that you need to know about. You can learn how not to make the big marker mistake in my deep dive video here.